Welcome to session 2 of the Non-Anxious Leader Family Systems Basics. This is the idea of family part 2. And as I mentioned, we are going to start each session with Kierkegaard's statement, "Now, Lord, with your help, I shall become myself." And today, one of the topics we're going to focus on is self-differentiation, which is really the central concept of family systems theory and is captured in this statement, "With your help, I shall become myself." And then again, leadership through self-differentiation is the idea that if we take responsibility for our own goals and for our own self while staying in touch with the rest of the organism, that is the rest of the system, staying emotionally connected to the rest of the people in the system, there is more than a reasonable chance that the body will follow. Even though there will be initial resistance, if we stay emotionally connected with the resistors, the body usually goes along. So that's kind of beginning with the end in mind and understanding what leadership through self-differentiation is. And now we're going to get into some of the concepts of the idea of family. In session 1, we covered the identified patient and homeostasis. And in this session, we will cover differentiation of self, extended family field, and emotional triangle. What Friedman says is the idea of self-differentiation is the capacity of a family member to define his or her own life's goals and values apart from surrounding togetherness pressures. And when many people hear that term surrounding togetherness pressures, they chuckle, sometimes even nervously, because if we're in a family system, more than likely we've felt those surrounding togetherness pressures. Oftentimes they focus on things like holidays or how we celebrate birthdays, or pressure that comes from other family members to fit with the system and do things the way we're supposed to do them. The idea of self-differentiation is to be a non-anxious presence. And the way I like to describe this is many of us are good at being a non-anxious non-presence. It's easy to not be anxious about how other people are functioning when we're really not emotionally connected. So, and the presence has less to do with physical presence and more to do with emotional presence. So it's really easy to be a non-anxious non-presence emotionally. On the other end of the scale is to be an anxious presence. That is to be present emotionally, but really to be anxious in someone else's space, to be anxious about how they're functioning, and to let our anxiety spill into that relationship. A non-anxious presence is somebody who is connected emotionally, but is not anxious about what goes on in the relationship, is able to be connected emotionally without letting anxiety spill in to that relationship. And Friedman has an example on pages 28 and 29 of how this might function in a hypothetical couple. And so at the one end, where both of the members of the couple are self-differentiated, the example he uses is that each could move toward or away from the other in separate, disengaged movements. If the husband said he was going to the movies, his wife would not be insulted if she were not invited. In fact, she could state, "I would like to go along." Or if he asked her to go along, she could feel free to say no, and he could still go. There would be a maximum of I statements defining position rather than blaming you statements that hold the other responsible for their own condition or destiny. At times, the partners might appear to be disconnected, but there is nothing internally wrong with the way they are connected, nothing to keep them from being close 1 minute or separating another minute, with minimum tugging on each other. So the idea here is that each one is able to state how they feel. They say, I would like to, I don't feel like, and not the blaming you. You never asked me to go. Why are you going without me? So that's kind of the extreme of self-differentiation, because in reality, probably a couple, two people are going to be less like this hypothetical couple. At the opposite end of the scale, to which we all are closer, Friedman writes, are two people who it's though they were fused to the ends of a stick. Whatever either does automatically moves the other. There is no thinking of self, only we and us and the blaming you. The nature of the relationship might appear close. They might appear to be together, but they are really stuck together. They will wind up either perpetually in conflict because they are so reactive to one another, or they will have a homing togetherness achieved through the total sacrifice of their own selves. In the latter case, the marriage might last 50 years, but their kids are likely to dysfunction all over America because, coming out of such an ill-defined system, they carry with them little capacity for autonomy in any emotional system. In other words, when there are not people who are self-differentiated in the family system, the family of origin, the kids don't learn how to make I statements, how to make take emotional stands in a non-anxious way, and so that means that they are not able to function healthfully in many systems, in any system that they're in. When we think about leadership and we think about families of origin or church families, one of the things that we know is that anxious systems are less likely to allow for differentiated leaders. So in a church family where there are people who are anxious, and family systems theory would say that these people are anxious typically because of unresolved issues in their own family of origin, and they bring that anxiety into the church system. Because when people are self-differentiated, they may have problems at home. We all have problems at home. And there may be problems in the church, but they typically are able to face those in non-anxious ways where they are realistic about things and are staying emotionally connected to people. When people are less self-differentiated, their anxiety then spills out into their relationships, whether it's their relationships in their family of origin or their relationships in the church. So a church that is an anxious system typically has people who are less well differentiated, less self-differentiated, and that anxiety spills into the church system. And they are less tolerant of self-differentiated leaders. They want leaders who are going to go along with the surrounding togetherness pressures all the time. This is how we do things. On the other hand, leaderless systems are more likely to be anxious. So even if there were self-differentiated people in the family system, in the church system, if there are not leaders who are helping to point the direction in a self-differentiated way, that creates anxiety in a system. So in a church that might otherwise even be well-functioning with self-differentiated people, if the leader, and in particular the pastor, but also the lay leadership, are not providing proper leadership, self-differentiated leadership, it is likely to create anxiety in that church system. In the congregational family, better differentiated members respond by defining themselves. So if, for example, the pastor of a church takes a stand and says, I think we need to be going here, or here's how I feel about this particular social issue. And notice the way that I'm making the statement is the leader is making a self-differentiated statement, taking an emotional stand, taking responsibility for her or his own beliefs, and says, I believe this. Better differentiated members will respond by defining themselves, will respond by saying, Pastor, I heard what you say, but I believe this. And so they're not blaming the pastor for how the pastor believes. They're just saying, well, you may believe this, but here's what I believe, or here's how I feel about that. Here's where I think we should go. Less well-differentiated members will respond by defining the clergy person. So the pastor preaches a sermon defining her or his position on a social issue, and the less well-differentiated members will say, how can you say that? Or you always do this. Or, you know, when you say that, do you realize that you are? And again, remember that I'm not, this could be any issue. I'm not talking about particular issues. This is the process of what goes on, not the content. So less well-differentiated members will define the leader, will respond by defining the leader instead of by defining themselves. In fact, one of the things Friedman suggests is if you want to see who is self-differentiated in a congregation, preach a sermon on a controversial issue and take an emotional stand. Do it in a non-anxious way. Claim your position. Use a maximum of I statements, and then see how people respond. And you can tell because the better differentiated members will define themselves, and the less differentiated members will define you when they talk to you after the sermon is over. So that's a general idea of self-differentiation and how it fits into both our own families of origin, in particular congregational families. The idea of the extended family field is that one's family of origin is not only an influence on our own nuclear family system, but it is the means by which issues are transmitted from generation to generation. So we have a nuclear family system, and depending on the configuration, that might be, 2 adults and children. It might be 1 adult and children. It might be just a single adult. But then the extended family field, our family of origin, is our parents, our aunts and uncles, our cousins, our grandparents. And the idea is that this extended family field has a set of unwritten rules. It's almost like software, that there's code that transmits issues from generation to generation in terms of how we deal with just about every issue in life. I mentioned earlier, every family system has a way it deals with holidays and birthdays. There are unwritten rules about those things. And when 2 people come together, their family system of origin, their extended family fields might have different unwritten rules. And at first, they have to figure out how to deal with that. How we raise children, how we deal with money, how we handle conflict, what happens, how issues of substance abuse or even violence. The list goes on and on and on in terms of how issues are transmitted from one generation to the next. And it's not that we have to repeat those, but it is that if we aren't aware of how our families of origins function, and we're not aware of how the issues have been transmitted, we are more likely to repeat. We're more likely to just follow the software, to follow the code without thinking. And so the idea of extended family field is that when we start to look at how we function, we want to look at our own family of origin, and in particular our extended family field, and say, where does this come from? Why do I feel this way? And if we can start to look at our network of relationships in our family of origin, and that can help us to understand how we function. In the same way, you can look at a congregational family and look at the previous generations, and you can also start to see patterns of how people function in the congregational family. One of the key concepts in both our families of origin and in congregational families is this idea of the emotional triangle. You might have heard the term of being triangled by 2 other people. And when you're triangled, you're basically being brought in to a relationship as a third party when the other two people should be dealing with each other directly. And the concept is that an emotional triangle is formed by any three persons or issues. So it could be three persons. So, for example, the worship leader of the band and the chair of the worship committee are in a conflict, and they triangle you in to that. So that could be three persons. Um, there could be two spouses, and the third issue is alcohol, so substance abuse. Again, it could be any three persons or issues, two people and an issue, two issues and a person. The basic law is that when any two parts of a triangle become uncomfortable with one another, they will focus on the third person or issue as a way to stabilize their own relationship with one another. In other words, they use this third person or issue as a means of avoiding having to deal with each other. So if we go to the case of a couple and alcohol, the alcohol is the way that the one person, the person who's drinking, is avoiding having to deal with the other person. And the focus on the alcohol as a problem is the way that the other person is really avoiding having to deal with their own relationship with each other. Triangling is the way that people avoid being self-differentiated. They avoid taking responsibility for themselves, their own issues, and being able to make emotional stands for themselves. There are 7 laws of emotional triangles, and I'm going to go through these rather quickly, but these are helpful to understand when we're being triangled or when we recognize a triangle in one of the systems to which we belong. The first is that balance is maintained among any two members by the way the third party relates to them. So if going back to that first example, if you're being triangled by the worship leader and the head of the worship committee, the way you relate to them is the way that the homeostasis is maintained. If you keep trying to get them to get along and you keep talking to one and then talking to other, they're going to keep you in the triangle, and that maintains a balance or a homeostasis, which keeps you triangled and keeps them having to deal with each other. A third party cannot generally bring lasting change to the relationship of the other two parties by trying to change their relationship directly. And again, going to this example, you're not going to be able to say to the worship leader, the chair of the worship committee is just trying to help out, so you should really work with her. Or saying to the worship chair, the worship leader is really just trying to help out, so you should really understand him. When you do this, they rarely are going to say, oh, you're right. I think I was wrong about them. In fact, going to law number 3, any attempts to try to get the two to work together and to try to convince one or the other that they need to be getting along better is not only going to be ineffective, but it's actually going to convert the homeostatic forces, those forces for balance or equilibrium, into the opposite intent. In other words, when you tell the worship leader to get along with the worship chair, he's just going to be even more resistant to that. Or if you tell the worship chair to get along with the worship leader, she's going to be even more resistant. Whether that's conscious or subconscious doesn't really matter. Sometimes it will be, but the net effect will be you're going to be still in the triangle, and it's going to be more entrenched than ever before. So don't try to get, if you're being triangled, don't try to get two people to get along. That is not going to work. To the extent the third party tries to unsuccessfully change the relationship of the other two, the more likely she or he will end up with a stress from the other two. So if you're the one being triangled in this example, and the more you try to get them to get along and it's not working, the more stress you are going to feel. So you could end up becoming the identified patient. You could end up being the one through whom the stress of the system becomes symptomatic. Maybe you can't sleep. Maybe you start yelling at people because you can't handle it. But to the extent that you try to change the relationship of the other two, you will end up with the stress. In a system, whether it's a family of origin, an extended family, or a church family, the various triangles in a system are interlocked. Therefore, trying to change one is resisted by homeostatic forces and the others by the system itself. What does that mean? Well, it's likely that the worship leader is in a triangle with somebody else, perhaps in the band or in their family of origin. And it's likely that the worship chair is in a triangle herself, or more than one, either with the worship committee, with the pastor, in their own family of origin, and all of those interlocking triangles. When you try to force change, are going to push back at you, and so you cannot force a system to change by getting the triangles to change, because the interlocking triangles are the effect of the homeostatic forces are going to push back even stronger to keep change from occurring. One side of the triangle tends to be more conflictual than others. So in the case of the worship leader, worship chair triangle, it's likely that the conflict is between those two, and they've drawn you in. In a family of origin, there might be a kid, who's having problems in school, and there are two parents in the home, and it's likely there's going to be conflict either between the two parents and not between either the parents and the kid, or between one of the parents and the kid and not between the other parent and child, and not between the two parents, or not as much conflict. In other words, one side of the triangle tends to have the most conflict, the other two sides less so, even though it might be occasional. And finally, one can only change a relationship to which one belongs. So one cannot, this really goes back to number 2, you can't change the relationship between the worship leader and the worship chair. You can only change a relationship between you and the worship leader, and you can only change the relationship between you and the worship chair. And one of the things that we'll start to look at when we understand how family process works, and remember, family process applies to both our individual family systems and the church family system. One of the things we'll look at is how that process works and how we get out of triangles so that people are forced to deal with their own issues. So the idea of triangling is complicated, but the simplest thing to understand is that we can only deal with the relationships to which we belong. So we can stop trying to get other people to get along with other people. We focus on our inputs into the relationships to which we belong, and we do it in a way that helps the family system or the church family system function in healthier ways. What we'll find out is that there's always going to be pushback, and the hardest thing for us to do is to stay a non-anxious presence through that resistance, through that pushback. But that's the only way that we're going to see change, and that's the only way we can function effectively as a leader. So that ends this session, and we've covered all 5 topics on the idea of family, and there will be 3 additional sessions, each on how family process works.